Oh, okay, there we go. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Janie Nolan, and I am the Executive Director of the American Avalanche Association. And we are honored to bring you this discussion around avalanche worker safety as part of our 2022 winter webinar series. And before I introduce the speakers, I want to take a minute to thank all of A3's industry supporting partners who make our work and events like this possible. And I ask that as you look at buying new gear or products, you turn to these folks. They support us, and so it would be great for us to support them. And with that, I'm going to introduce our panel for tonight's conversation. So combined, the speakers you are about to hear have more than 70 years of experience in the snow and avalanche industry. Our first panelist tonight is Don Sharaf. Don has taught avalanche and mountaineering courses for the last 25 years and has been a heli ski guide and avalanche forecaster in Alaska for the last 15 years. Don is a former owner of the American Avalanche Institute and currently works in risk analysis and as a search and rescue team member. Our next panelist is Becs Hodgetts. Becs has more than 20 years of experience in the avalanche industry. She has worked as a ski patroller, as well as backcountry and highway forecaster in New Zealand and North America. And Becs is currently the lead forecaster for the Southern Mountains with the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. And last, but certainly not least, is Scott Savage. Scotty has spent nearly 2 decades working as a ski patroller, avalanche forecaster, and snow safety director at Big Sky Resort before he joined the Sawtooth Avalanche Center in 2012. Scotty is currently the director of the Sawtooth Avalanche Center and an important advisor to the board of directors for the American Avalanche Association. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you three for a conversation on avalanche worker safety.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Janie. So we're going to try to keep this moving pretty quickly here tonight to keep things hopping. But our goals are, selfishly, and Bex, Don, and I all agree on this, that us getting to do this is awesome because it gets us thinking. But that's our primary goal tonight, probably. Well, not primary, but we want to get you thinking about things. We're not going to present new material that you've never heard, but just to try to get you thinking about ways that you can create discussions within your operations and among different operations, and then ultimately help avalanche workers come home safe at the end of each day and get home to their friends and family. So a little housekeeping stuff. How are we going to run this tonight? So participation's key. Life is not a spectator sport. So there are going to be polls. We want this to be an interactive discussion as much as we can. Zoom's tougher than being live until we're in a live audience. It is what it is. But we're going to break this up into several segments. So like a question, discussion, And if you have a question that you want to ask while it's fresh in your mind on topic, we want to encourage people to do that. So we want this to be an active discussion with the audience and the three of us. And if you have something that you think of later, feel free to save it to the end. There will be time at the end for kind of an open, freewheeling Q&A and discussion as well too. But please ask questions. Live is great. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can type it into the Q&A or the question and answer box. And between Eric and Janie, they're the Wizards of Oz behind the scenes, behind the curtains, who are helping make all this run. They'll make sure that either they type in an answer or we get to it and answer it live. If you know that you want to ask a specific person a question, so if you have a question for Bex or Don, then feel free to target them directly when you're asking that. So with that, we're going to get going. So our little bit of an introduction here. This is from a paper that Ethan Green, Bruce Jameson, and Spencer Logan did for an ISSW in 2014. So a project that they came up with trying to quantify what is the fatality rate for avalanche workers. And you can see down there at the bottom, the last one with the little asterisk, and this is the US. They did it for North America. Canadian was fairly similar. It was 21 point something else. But that's 21 fatalities per 100,000 workers per year. So roughly a 1 in 5,000 worker every year, 1 in 5,000 Avalanche workers dies while they're at work. It's hard, our brains don't work that well with large probabilities, or excuse me, small probabilities, so big numbers. But to put it in perspective, we're right up there with offshore oil workers and the world's deadliest catch crew out there in the Bering Sea, the crab fishermen. So probably not the company, those are not the company you want to keep necessarily, but it is what it is. So another little piece of research that Christer Christensen, Manuel Jensveen, and Werner Munter did at ISSW also in 2012, they tried to look at things more cumulatively. So they took the European data, and it turns out that basically 1 in every 50,000 ski tour days is what they came up with ends up in a fatality. And then they looked at things for different users. So whether you're a free rider, ski touring, or professional mountain guide. And the kind of the scary part is right there, that at what they deem to be like the accurate fatality rate for, and this is European data that they were using, mostly Swiss, but roughly if you have a professional mountain guide who's working that level, 100 days per season for 20 years, then 30 days per season for 20 years. Based on that cumulative exposure, 1 in 20 of them, if they worked that full period throughout their career, they would expect 1 in 20 to be dead. For the work that Green, Jamison, and Logan did over the 50-year career with their data, it would be roughly 1 in 100. So it's still in the same ballpark there that we're looking at. And Eric will put up some links to both of these papers in the chat, so you can get some more information if you want to dig in a little deeper. So this statement, I think it's something that Becs, Don, and I all agree with in our discussions that we've had coming into this event, that we work in a dangerous environment, but we would say it doesn't necessarily have to be a dangerous job. That the decisions made by operations and by individuals, that's what's going to dictate whether you're in a dangerous environment, but whether what you're doing is dangerous or not, that's up to you and your operation. So we're going to spend the rest of the evening kind of exploring that and basically circle back around to it at the end. So Eric, if we could bring up our first poll. Bear with us for a second here. We'll have a poll for you to fill out, and there we go. So are we getting close there, Eric? All right, maybe we can pop up the results. So interesting. For the bulk of folks, it's true. There's some, pretty much a minority there, that say they can't change the safety culture in my operation, which this is very healthy that a lot of people feel like they can. If we move to the question here that we're going to pose while we have, and you can leave this up if you want, Eric, the poll results. But the question is, so I'd like to hear some thoughts on how line workers can improve their operation safety culture, and then how about middle managers? And maybe Don, I'll pose that one to you. How do you think middle managers can potentially change the safety culture in their operation?
No, it's interesting because I feel like most of the push for a safer job environment has come from either owners or supervisors. So um, in general, it seems like the workers were pretty content with the level of risk that they took. So it really took um, either the owners or the managers to say, hey, we can accomplish these same goals with a lower level of risk. And um, that really just took buy-in and showing that, hey, you can approach this job um, and get the area open. You can get the educational message out. You can open the slopes for your guests and meet their desires, taking a lot less risk. But it took a really concerted dialogue to um, convince them that, hey, we can do this more safely and meet the outcomes that you all expect of yourselves. You don't have to be um, as exposed as you historically have been to make people happy or to get to learn about avalanches. So I think it takes just a lot of um, conversation. It's like, hey, what are your concerns here? Um, well, I think we can address those and still meet our target. So it's definitely, I feel, can be top down directed, but it needs a lot of buy-in, and that takes a little bit of time and definitely dialogue.
Yeah, no, I think that really rings true. Bex, what do you think more from a line worker perspective? What kind of position are those folks in to change culture?
Yeah, I agree with Dawn. Like it's a top down thing, this culture shift. I think personally from my experience, there's kind of three things that work for line level people. Like first, you want to be like personally accountable, right, for your own assessment of the hazard. So you're responsible as a group, obviously, to understand the goal of the organization and what the objective is for the day. But as an individual, like you need to understand and be able to communicate to your group the risk or the hazard that you're going to be trying to mitigate, or the risks that you may be taking or may not be taking. So understanding what you're doing is really important. And that's one thing that I kind of would love to change from my ski patrolling career. And I'm hoping, I haven't been in the patrolling world for, nearly 8 to 10 years now, but I really bought into that bravado scene for a while there, and go, 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 let's do it, like get it open, don't stop, keep pushing. And if I were to be in the same situation now, I would slow down a lot. And kind of that moves into my next thought here, is like communication within your group. So it's kind of basically workplace etiquette, to be nice to one another, but really getting to a place where you're having like honest, like humble communication about what it is you're seeing out there, what are we doing, what are our goals for the day. A good example is like, what kind of avalanche problem are we looking at? Is it storm slab, is it wind slab? What are we going to do if the wind slabs are bigger and harder than we thought? Having this discussion prior to going out, when often, like, at least from, I'm an old timer now, so I would just like kind of tag along with whoever, and we wouldn't have these bigger risk and hazard type discussions. And so I don't feel like back then I was necessarily making the greatest, most informed decisions that I could. And then I think for like improving their safety, lines folks speaking to their supervisors, like, or your management, if you see something that you want to change in your workplace, coming at it with not a lot of emotion, talking to your coworkers, coming up with a plan, like, do we all feel the same way about this? And come to your supervisor with the same way that you speak to one another, like respectfully, understand that they're looking at a much bigger picture than you are. And even like small gains in your workplace can mean a lot over a certain amount of time, like just tiny steps. I think often we want to change the world right here and now, and we underestimate the power of small changes to legacy programs can get you there just as fast. So I think those are places that we can really work as boots on the ground type people to improve our safety. And your manager might not, I mean, even though they may have a lot going on and may not respond how you feel like is appropriate at the time, but it's not just a time to throw your hands up in the air, but just keep nudging, keep having like this respectful, open communication. I think you'll get there in the end. That's my kumbaya speech again.
No, I think that's great. I think it's interesting, like especially in the ski industry and really probably any operation where the highest level of manager that's still directly involved with daily operations every day, that it seems like that level has a lot of ability to change things potentially by bringing it up the chain and taking things from the bottom. Have you kind of, both of you, I'll pose that to both Don and Becs, that level almost seems like the key to eliminate any inertia for improving safety culture, where it might not necessarily be the CFO who has no clue what you're doing, but more the highest level that's there, kind of, not necessarily in the trenches, but the people that you're seeing every day, or at least having a role in the decision making. That they seem like the key players in the avalanche industry, from my experience. Have you seen the same thing?
I'd say in part because they understand and speak the same language as the workers who are bringing up the points. So someone in admin who's never done avalanche reduction or never been like the first one out on a high hazard guiding day, they don't tend to get it as much as someone who's been in your shoes. And so they're more approachable for the workers, but they, with their connection to the management, that makes them a very, very good conduit. So yeah, I think the GMs that were former snow safety or ski patrollers, you definitely hear more good stories about that setup than ones who came with their MBA.
Yeah, no, agreed. I was always jealous of where Becs used to work today Basin. It seemed like they had a good run of mountain managers and GMs coming from ski patrol, snow safety for some time. I don't know if that's still the case.
I think so. I mean, we had a pretty favorable era for a long time there.
Yeah.
Still do. Yeah, I agree. I think the biggest learning piece for me going from line level to middle management is what I spoke to earlier. Like, these things don't just happen overnight. They're institutional changes, and they take time.
All right. We'll keep it hopping here. Move on to the next topic. So, and we're starting off kind of by design with some more operational level things that also obviously impact the individual, and then we'll boil down to more individual decision making and thoughts as we go. So policy, safety policy in this particular instance is a combination of procedures and recommendations. And procedures, or SOPs, they tend to be kind of rule-based, formal, not tend to, they are. They're mandated and they have consequences. Speed limit's a really good example, versus recommendations are suggestions, or maybe you should do this, or you're advised to do this. Kind of like when you go to the tire store and the person might say, hey, we really suggest you replace your tires, but they're not going to make you do it. There is no rule that, at least in this country, that says you have to. In European countries, you'd get in trouble for driving around like that, but not down here. And then something that we're all very near and dear to in the recent couple of years, kind of blurs the line a little bit. It's policy where it is a mixture of procedures or SOPs or mandated rules and recommendations. So you can have some things like masks with COVID recently, that they kind of gravitate back and forth depending on conditions. So it can be situational, triggered by certain criteria, where a recommendation becomes a rule or a SOP or a procedure, and then goes back and forth. And as we've all seen anecdotally and with research, that the adherence to whether it's a recommendation or procedure can really vary. And it'll be really interesting to see the volumes of research that'll come out of that procedure versus recommendation with regard to COVID masking going forward. And as we shift kind of over to our world and the Avalanche world, a lot of commonalities there with COVID masking, with PPE. That's a classic example, and we'll kind of go to where we tend to have the most formality or most formal written SOPs and rules in our industry, which tends to be PPE, specifically, beacon, shovel, and probe. I think it's pretty rare that people have to carry those, and it's not written down that any avalanche worker is carrying them. Then you get to airbags and helmets, and it starts to, some of it, depending on the operation, it may become just a suggestion all the time or a recommendation, or it may be when you're doing activity X, then you need to wear PPE, whatever that may be. And then ski cutting, we move kind of a little bit into the less formal. There are definitely some formal SOPs, like a lot of operations will say we don't ski cut hard slabs, or we don't ski cut when a known weak layer is more than a meter deep. But a lot of it is based on recommendations in any formal safety plan or operating plan. And then you get to where it gets really gray. It's really difficult for a lot of what we do in the avalanche world to come up with formal standard operating procedures or rules for, say, going into exposed or consequential terrain. Especially with the more mitigation based folks, how do you quantify and come up with a clean set of guidelines for when you're doing activity X, because you're dealing with, just a really complex environment with a ton of permutations and combinations. So it's really difficult to make things all procedures or, formally spelled out standard operating procedures. So the question I have for Becs here to start out with is there room for both formal SOPs and recommendations in operational safety policy in the avalanche world?
Yes.
Yes.
No, I mean, you covered a bunch of it anyway, Scott. Like, there's those non-negotiable SOPs with PPE or the explosives use and things like that are really easy to be black and white. But then we work in this dynamic environment where you trend over to this recommendation area. In the group that I'm working with at the moment, we have a staff size of around 20, so very small. And stealing from an awesome comment that Don made that really resonated with me the other night is, like, you really have to train to that, right? To these recommendations, because you're working in a bit of a gray zone. So, one day this area may be totally fine to go in and work in, and another day it's completely off the table. So we have to all understand, like, what the purpose of our job for that day is, like, what's our mission, very clear understanding of that, and what level of risk we're willing to take to achieve that goal. And like in our, we're highway and backcountry forecasters, so the amount of risk that we're willing to take for a tiny piece of data is not very high at all. Whereas in Don's line of work, like, they're hanging it out there a little more than we are. So I think with our small group, and we have, obviously operational plans that we talk through together. I feel like we manage that pretty well. And that kind of goes to that scalable piece, but maybe Don, you want to chime in and we could talk about scale in a minute, but I know, like, you work in a very different environment. So do you feel like recommendations fit your workplace?
Yeah, it's a super challenging one. And we are, guiding, we're always talking about what are the industry standards and are we in compliance with that? Are we, how are we behaving? And if everyone's doing it this way, can we justify doing it the way that we've always done, that we think is appropriate? And those are tough questions to answer, and you really need to do some soul searching when you do it. I've found that recommendations work really well with smaller operations where you know and trust everyone on your staff and that you've got deep experience and everyone has a grasp of the kind of the task and the purpose and the intent behind those recommendations, and they can make judgment calls with with enough training and with enough experience and understanding of their coworkers, that it works pretty well. But I've seen two organizations go from ones where I knew everyone and had worked pretty much with everyone at it to expanding quite a bit to the point where there's just a lot of new people. And then that point, it gets a little nerve-wracking, and you want to have a little more, a few more policies and procedures to defend against, hey, I don't know how that person might react. And it's a tough line to decide what do we make mandatory and what do we leave out there as a recommendation? Because if the recommendation doesn't have buy-in, people are not going to do it. And I think COVID's a really good example of that. The big thing that we have to keep in mind, I think, in industry is that if we don't do a good job of policing ourselves and giving ourselves enough guidance within the industry, that OSHA or other outfits may come in and kind of dictate for us. And I've seen that in Alaska, where following a couple of guide fatalities, Alaska OSHA came in and they made recommendations, really strong recommendations. No, policy changes and requirements. They weren't recommendations. They were like, if you don't do this, you get fined. Where we had to have very strict bloodborne pathogen training. We learned how to use fire extinguishers, and we were much more in line with commercial fueling procedures. But as far as actually skiing on the snow, they had no understanding of it, and they made no recommendations whatsoever or policies for it. So the short version of this answer is, yes, there's room for both. You need to think carefully about how much you can rely on your employees' judgment, and then how you can train them to make good decisions.
And Don, those Alaska OSHA changes, that was a direct result, basically, of some Avalanche accidents, correct? That was following the
Correct. It
Southeast
had
accidents.
absolutely nothing to do with fire extinguishers.
Yeah, just the kind of, they had to do something.
Yep.
Knee jerk.
What are you guys' opinion? Like, so say you have an area like Breckenridge where they have 100+ patrollers to communicate with, and sort of taking that ICS structure, which I know a lot of operations do. They'll have like a group of Avalanche technicians who operate, everybody's working under the same SOPs, but here's this like strike force team that can work in this gray area. Do you think that, or I guess work under recommendations because their environment's so dynamic? Do you think that works? How do you think that can work on a staff so big?
I think it helps, and coming from Big Sky wasn't as big as that when I was there. It is now. It was maybe 50 employees when I was there, and now it's over 100. It's probably like Breckenridge, but compared to now, I have it's a crew of 4, and it definitely, you feel better about having recommendations and suggestions with a crew of 4. I don't necessarily think that that's the right answer, though, because anyone can have a bad day at any given point in time, or a bad minute is all it takes when they don't follow that recommendation or suggestion. So, I think that the formal SOPs and formalizing, anything you can in writing, the more you can, the better, no matter the size of the operation. But I think it really shows itself in larger operations, just because it's a numbers game where you have 100 people who can have a bad minute or a bad 5 minutes and not make a good decision following a suggestion or a recommendation, versus 4 people. You're just going to have that happen far fewer times. I guess personally, that's where I'm at. Don?
Well, I think it falls back on the safety culture we just discussed. If you have recommendations and you're working with, have coworkers close by and they call you out and we're like, hey, we should be doing this right now because it's appropriate for this moment, and the recommendations apply to that. Not necessarily using that language, but calling you out when you're getting lax. So that safety culture can help with recommendations. The flip side of that is we've been functioning for decades with lots of recommendations and very few SOPs. And that's led us to the injury rate and fatality rate that we currently have. We have analogs in different industry, whether it be wildland firefighting or aviation, where they have far more SOPs, and they have made significant progress. So like it or not, I think we may need to move in that direction, but it needs to be extremely thoughtful. And again, the more dialogue you have with your workers and the more they understand it, the better it will go.
Nice.
Yeah. Kind of a little bit, well, it's all the same topic, but with situational protocols and procedures, a lot of places, especially ski areas, I think are more, active mitigation where you're opening or closing terrain kind of places are, this happens more from my experience, and I'm curious to see what the two of you think, but I think it's something that can work pretty well where in that setting where you have a base set of written formal guidelines, and then things tighten up when certain criteria are met. So whether it's, certain amounts of precip, or you're seeing remote triggering, or when something happens, then you shift to this where things that were suggestions become mandatory. I'm curious if you've worked in operations that work that way, and if you've seen it work or not work, or what are your thoughts on that?
I haven't, Scott, we didn't, at the ski areas that I worked at, hopefully I'm not wrong and I have a boss is going to call me out, but we didn't have we didn't have set criteria for if A equals BDC. But I can see how that would help and create a happier workplace, because people like to know where they stand. And especially, obviously it keeps people safe too, but I think it would work well. That's all I got.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know that I've encountered that either. The one caveat to that is if you're situational and it's something that requires some practice or reminding, people may not be as good at adopting it correctly. So, always or never. We're going to talk about that later in this webinar, but I think that has application to SOPs as well. Always, sometimes, or never.
Yeah, definitely. And we will hit that. Good foreshadowing. So anyone out there, if you have any questions about anything we're talking about or comments, please, we have one here, SOP versus SOG.
Operating guideline.
Standard operating procedures versus standard operating guidelines. I'm guessing that's what that is referring to.
That was my interpretation, and just the connotation to me, because I haven't dealt with those acronym, the SOG acronym, but guidelines always strike me as synonymous with recommendations. And then you're back into this debate that we've just addressed. Is it a policy or is it a recommendation? Yeah,
no, I'd agree. It's going to be one or the other. You can make it situational, but it's inevitably going to be one or the other. Either it's something you're allowed to do or not, or it's something that you have the leeway to choose what you want to do, whether it's suggested or recommended or not. All right, we'll move on to the next one. So Eric, if we can launch the poll on near misses, please. All right. Then once the voting slows down here to a crawl, Eric will pop up the results. So hopefully everyone's on the ball. We're winding it down here.
All these people wouldn't do very well in Jeopardy.
All right, go ahead and pop it up there, Eric. So, Bex, anything surprising there to you? What do you think?
And 11 to 20, and they're still around to fill in the poll. No, I don't know. Sorry. No, I mean, pretty broad spread.
Yeah. Don, you see anything that jumps out at you there?
Yeah, it's, there's so much to interpret there. It's like, how many years experience do these people have as far as trends go? And that's the biggest question that comes out to me. With that distribution, it really doesn't, nothing's standing out to me at first glance.
So this is the results from a survey that Jerry Johnson from Montana State and myself and Matt Wheeland came up with it. And then we got some other sharp folks, Pascal Hagley and Jordi Hendricks, to work on coming up with, what does it mean after doing that survey? So we had a lot of people in the audience, I'm sure, filled this out back in 2012. And it was about 600 respondents. But if you look on the far left, near miss with no personal consequences, for the ski area folks, it was right around 7 that they had averaged in their career. And the median age or median experience was about 15 to 20 years for this. So sorry if those, we're seeing a comment there that the labels are too fuzzy to read. So on the far left, the set of 5 bars in the bar graph says near miss with no personal consequences. And the 2 on the far left, the orange and the blue, are ski area workers. And then the purple in the center of that big spike is backcountry ski snowmobile guides. And you have avalanche educator in red and backcountry avalanche forecaster in green. So, a fair amount of people having many, in my opinion, near misses or close calls, and really injuries too, that, most of those folks in ski area world had averaged over 1 injury at work. And that's, not just like putting a Band-Aid, the way that we labeled the question, it was a significant injury. So moving on from that, the first question for you, Don, is how many near misses are too many?
Yeah, so we discussed this a couple of days ago when we were prepping for this, and I've had a while to think about this question. And really, if you're in the wrong spot or at the wrong time, 1 can be really too many. But I have to say that the most powerful learning I've had is from these near misses. Some people call them free lessons, where a bad result didn't happen, but it certainly could have. And so it really, in a certain sense, it's unanswerable. But I would say this. My friend Don Carpenter said, and calls, looks at terrain and he says, that's DBFW terrain. So don't be wrong terrain, if you will. And if you're in that type of terrain, you have to be extremely cautious. You have to be really careful. And because you can't be wrong, the consequences are way too high. And then I was reviewing Robert de Boer's presentation, and he suggests being innovative, but under controlled circumstances. And I think that's a really good point. It's like where you have more forgiving snowpack or forgiving terrain, friendlier runouts, smaller start zones. I think these are all places that are, I wouldn't say the place to get caught in avalanches, but it's better than in that don't be wrong terrain. And I think when you're can give yourself wider margins in that type of forgiving environment, that's the place to learn about the snowpack. And it's certainly, I find that investigating weird, big avalanche cycles is my greatest learning. And I try not to be having near misses during those big cycles. But it's, I think, a way to learn is choose smaller start zones with friendlier runouts. And if in doubt, certainly back off. If you need, if you don't think a ski cut's going to cut it, use a shot. But saying, oh, well, near misses are unacceptable and we need to, change everything. There was a near miss. It wasn't an accident. That's kind of my perspective. The biggest thing that I recognized in myself after the fact was that I had a number of near misses in a couple of years, and I was pretty cavalier about it. It's like, oh, I'm getting to the edge, but not going over it. And indeed, I was actually going over it and not really understanding that it was leading to an accident. So I think that was a little bit of a circuitous answer, but hopefully it helped.
No, it did. And so I'll throw the next one to you, Bex. So, we obviously learn from our near misses when we experience them personally. So do you learn from reading about near misses or studies of near misses and close calls too? What's your experience there?
It's an interesting question because like currently I'm in the business of avoiding triggering avalanches at work or in recreation. So, we're in a really low feedback environment beyond like what Don referred to, small test slopes and like pokey little things that we can trigger with next to no consequence. And like, so yes, you can learn from reading about other near misses. I think so. You can relate to situations you may have been on, or maybe it'll trigger something when you're in a similar situation yourself in the future. Not the most captivating reads all the time, but I think what's really important about recording near misses as an industry is that then we can use that information to work out where we're screwing up. Are there common situations that we're finding ourselves in that we as an industry can then address as a safety concern? And Scott, I think you got something that can help us with that.
Yeah, kind of. Back several years ago, Bill Williamson, Ethan Green, and myself, we kind of came to the same conclusion that, if you want to solve a problem, what's the best first thing you need to do is, collect some data so you can figure out what the problem is. And if you're looking at just the avalanche worker fatalities, which is what information is widely available to all operations, you're just looking at, such a small sliver of where people have made mistakes. So we created this avalanchenearmiss.org, a near miss database, and then we've been woefully neglectful about advertising it, branding it, marketing it, and making it happen. So we get a really robust data set. But that's the goal with this, is that people can submit anonymous near miss reports from what's going on, and it is geared towards avalanche professionals, what's happening while they're working. So it's not a recreational database. That's an entirely different scale project. So the way it works, people would submit the information, then a reviewer goes through it and scrubs anything out that could be identifying at all before it's posted, and then it's a to delete process basically. So none of that information is stored. So it is completely anonymous to the individual and the operation. That being said, check to make sure it's okay with your operation before you do submit anything that happens at work, because, especially in the ski area world, we live in a very litigious society, unfortunately, and the lawyers for the company may have a different opinion than you about sharing information for the better good. So yeah, you can submit things, and then on the viewing side, the goal is that when there's enough data that it's meaningful, that people will, it's open for whoever wants to grab it and do studies with it. You can filter it by keywords. You can look at cornice or hard slab and bring up all the accidents or incidents, close calls that fit any particular criteria that you're looking for. So potentially a really powerful tool, but we need to do a better job of getting people to submit and getting a decent sized data set for that at this point. But yeah, I think it is something that you mentioned there, Bex, is really important, that, we learn from events that happen to us. They're incredibly powerful. It's our memory is really effective at storing those, and you can recall what happened compared to when you're reading something and it's just a bunch of facts that you're reading out of a book, or reading, the history of close calls or the snowy torrents or something like that. Yes, you will remember some things. It's probably better than nothing, but the research tends to show that there's no substitute for the actual experience compared to reading. So I think that the true benefit of things like this, and whether it's in the medical world, aviation, you name it, and they have, firefighting, medical, and aviation have way better near miss reporting systems. That's where we stole this from, was worked with the National Association or International Association of Firefighting Chiefs to kind of copy what they already had for the most part. And I think that's the key, to get a ton of data entries there. So you actually have something where you can identify the true problems. And like you said, Bex, figure out where are our trip up points, where are the problems that we're seeing in there.
Yeah, and Scotty, like you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. There's a ISSW paper from like Hall and Huber and Reardon from like 2014 or something, but they looked at ski patrol accidents at an Aspen ski area, and used it to identify just trends within their operation. And there's no reason why operation scale can't be looked at too. And they did. They found for them some pretty alarming statistics, I guess, in an area that they could work on with their crew. And I think every operation definitely has the ability to do that. So that's a great place to start too. But
yeah, no, that's
sharing information is really key.
No, that's a great point, that the relatively small data sets and operations, it still is extremely valuable. Doug Richmond did some similar work looking at things, and Ron Simonois and I looked at a small data set, and you do get some things from that for sure. Let's see. So we're going to go to the next poll. So if you want to launch this one, Eric, and it's interesting where, we can be wearing the same gear, the same PPE, the same skis, go to the same place, a lot of us. Some days we'll be at work and following whatever our operational risk tolerance is, and some days we'll be at play and following our own personal risk tolerance. So we have very different profiles, which it's a pretty slippery slope from that standpoint. I think it's a little bit unique from there. So we'll see what these results are from the poll. And then we do have one, and Don, I'm going to kick this to you. It's while we're waiting for folks to finish filling this out, a question from Halstead. So do you think snowy torrents is better for teaching or for professionals to review accidents and learn from them, like individually? You have thoughts on that?
I've used it for both. Honestly, it's, the the bulk of the snowy torrents is recreational accidents. So that definitely fits into avalanche education for recreationalists. There's some good write-ups of professional accidents, and the beauty of the snowy torrents is people have taken the time to write them up fully, and they're generally more complete than you might get just from a avalanche center report. And so I think the snowy torrents is excellent for teaching. It's okay for pros, but I like the Nearmiss database in that it's searchable and addresses pro Nearmisses more specifically. But I also think that I've used the snowy torrents to look up accidents that occurred as they related to highway mitigation, and I got a really good picture recently doing some work in Alaska from various snowy torrent reports. So snowy torrents definitely not just for educators. I think it's useful for everyone. And I'm surprised at the number of times that I go to it for various reasons.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. So there we have the results up, and pretty interesting, the almost exact even split there. So, Bex, how did you answer this one?
I said recreating, and I'm guessing, my guess is that split is between people who avoid avalanches for a living and people who mitigate avalanches for a living. I guess that would have been a good poll.
Yeah. Do you want to expand on that? Just explain, like, say your previous job versus this job, and how you had kind of a shift. You and I are similar in that standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. So ski patrolling, we're trying to get terrain open, beginning to the end of the season. You're mitigating avalanches, so you're effectively trying to trigger them, whether that's on skis or with explosives. So both have their level of risk associated with them. And then now moving on to more of a forecasting based, especially backcountry and the highway. We're forecasting. So we're either testing it with explosives, or we're in a situation where we're not. The backcountry forecasting is such a broad brush that we don't need that one piece of specific data from that start zone or that 40-degree slope is not going to make any difference, and it's definitely not worth the risk, but it's not going to make enough difference to our forecast to justify us going into that kind of terrain, because we're not slope scale forecasting. We're doing a much, our area is much larger than that. So the risk that we put ourselves, the hazard that we expose ourselves to in those two different jobs are quite different, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And when we were talking amongst the three of us, it was very apparent where, so I guess Don, I'd like to hear what you have to say about it, and then also, your take on the effects of, as people age, how that changes the equation.
You saying I'm getting old?
No, I am. You're just a young pup.
No, it's funny because I mentioned this question to a coworker of mine up here at the heli ski operation, and she laughed and said, "Duh, yeah, definitely at work." And it's an odd situation here where you're not moving around and doing much when it's cloudy and storming, and then the second it gets cleared, then you're going out. And the Albert to Spain, wait 48, 72 hours, and you can live a long life as a postal carrier in Little Cottonwood. That doesn't work up here. It's, instead of waiting 3 days, we were lucky if we wait, 30 minutes. So it's definitely a riskier environment for me working than I choose to make as a recreationalist. But we certainly have guides up here who push the envelope recreating as well. So it's not necessarily the answer for everyone at this operation, but it is intriguing in that we don't use explosives, yet I wouldn't call us entirely avalanche avoiders either. So we do a lot of ski cutting when the avalanche problems allow that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting where the mechanized guiding tends to fit a lot more with the avalanche makers than the avalanche avoiders, probably like we've talked about, due to just how fast things happen. I think plays a role in the behavior becoming more like that, not having the time to plan on the way up. We're going to move to the next poll. Keep things moving, Eric, if you want to launch that one. So this is about decision-making frameworks or decision-making aids. And a couple of folks have answered questions here, just so the folks that have or asked questions, the folks that asked them know, yes, we are seeing those. I have a couple cached here for the end because they're not fitting in exactly with any of the last two little polls that we're going to launch, and then we'll definitely have a catch-all discussion, and I'll get to those questions then. So don't think I'm blowing you off here. All right, we're getting close to showing those results, Eric. All right. So, and the goal of this question was, more for real time. So not necessarily morning planning, coming up with like trip planning, but when you're actually out in the field. I'm not sure if everyone took it that way or not. I think it's about what I would have expected. Do you guys have any, Don, any comments on that? Or Becs?
Sorry.
What's
Yeah, I'm
that?
trying to figure out the trends. The polls have been very ambiguous for me, and it makes me realize that they're pretty hard to write. So
I think that what jumps out is that how few of the people that are saying always, and I was one of them, so there's only one other out there. Yeah, I think it goes back to something when you mentioned Robert DeBoer and with the aviation industry and medical, where they have very strict decision-making frameworks that they follow when things go bad, like the plane that went down in the Hudson. It was okay, both engines are blown, get the book out, what are we supposed to do? And someone's telling them, do this, now do this, now do this, now do this. So it's a lot more regimented in other industries for sure. Whether that can or will happen here, who knows? Someone just popped up a great comment or question that says maybe people are using them unconsciously, which I'm sure they are. A lot of that, there's a lot of research on, the military, especially special forces. That's how they train. So these, frameworks become integrated into the way that you operate, where it's at a subconscious level, just through repetition. And I'm sure a lot of folks are using them unconsciously. Personally, I think the problem with decision-making frameworks, both benefit and problem, is that if you don't use them all the time, you're going to tend to justify not using them sometime when you should be. And I think without having it be effectively a rule, you run that risk of throwing it out when you really need to be using it, because it doesn't fit into your motivated reasoning or your ulterior motive or whatever it may be. It's inconvenient on a big powder day if something says don't ski me and you're pretty confident nothing's going to happen. I don't know.
I think the downside of occasional framework use or checklist use is that you're not very good at it, or not as good as you need to be. And, I look at that with the GAR framework and working into that as a SAR team member. And initially it is long, and we'd introduce it in trainings, and 25 minutes later, like, oh my gosh, that person's dead. We're still talking through this framework, and we've done nothing. Then I've seen it implemented by a professional team, but in the National Park Service, where it went very quickly and was really, really useful. So the practice makes perfect, really does apply. It's another skill, if you will. And it's really, it really speaks to your answer of always. It's like you use it always because you're good at it. It's not time consuming. And it's just become a really good habit.
Yeah, Scotty, this conversation was really good for me, like in the spirit of like honest and humble conversation. Like I talked to much of the group that I work with down here, and none of us answered yes to that question. So it's going to be a good thing for us all to reflect on. We definitely fell back on the, subconsciously we do it, but that's not really, as you guys have pointed out, it's not how it works. Because you'll just, we're people, we'll select what's convenient for us at the time for the greatest, what we think is reward. So it's good. Yeah, it's going to be a really good talking point for us going forward.
Yeah, interesting.
I also think that you've come up with one of the best checklists or decision-making frameworks that I've heard of. So I really think you should share that.
Okay, I'll make it real quick. So we got to keep it moving. And it's a separate seminar or TAR article. I promise, Lynn, if you're out there, I'll get it to you. But I asked myself, can I do this or can I ski this? So the C is consequences. It takes about 20 seconds before any decision about skiing a slope or choosing a route uphill. Think about what's going to happen. And you need a certain amount of experience to be able to visualize, what the expected conditions of what you have, what could happen. So actually picture the avalanche running with you in it or you watching it. And then A, how's the accident report going to read? We don't do very well thinking about, okay, I could break my femur or I could break my arm, but we do think a lot about, Scott Savage, Avalanche Center Director, was caught in a avalanche skiing a 38-degree wind-loaded slope. He wrote the forecast that said those slopes were considerable. The same day, I'm going to look like a moron. So our pride and ego is a way more powerful deterrent than getting hurt when it comes to making decisions about doing or not doing something. And then N stands for either no or hell yes. So when I come up with the ultimate decision, am I going to do this? The answer fits into one of those two baskets. And if the answer is, I think I can get away with it if I just kind of tread lightly and don't fall, that's no. If there's any question at all, if it's not hell yes, then it becomes no, which just adds some extra safety margin into the equation that I probably wouldn't build in otherwise. And I'll usually catch myself 2 or 3 times a year backing off of something because of that. So who knows if one of those times is the magic one that would have got me or not, but it's just something that I've come up with over the years. And yeah, I think what you said, Don, about it being a habit, that's the key, that you have to come up with something that's really quick, really easy to remember. I can remember 3 things. If it's a letter like can or a word like can I ski this? But much more than that, it stresses my old brain out. Like I can't remember all of Elk Truth at this point, especially not at the top of every slope. So yeah, I guess, there's some other questions here, and I think we're going to move on just so we can get to the last couple things. But we covered the always, sometimes, never for sure. And then at work, at play, both or neither. That's just a question that I'd pose to people to think about, that just because you're using something at work, is that a reason to not do it when you're recreating? It all depends on your risk tolerance profile. Are you willing to accept a lot more risk in your recreational life than you are at work? Then you probably don't need to. But if you want to tone the risk down, then it probably makes sense to try something similar in your recreational world. So Eric, last poll, avalanche education, please. All right, so we'll get the answers in here, and then I think we'll hopefully another 5-10 seconds. I'm sure they're still pouring in, but starting to trickle. So Don, what do you think about that? I mean, you have as much experience as anyone teaching Avalanche classes and specifically pro classes.
I'm super glad it's not really heavily biased towards no, but it's a huge question that any Avalanche educator should ask themselves is, are we doing a service? Are we setting people up well? Are we giving them the tools, the skills, the knowledge to set them up to continue learning? And boy, if you think your only learning is coming from an Avalanche class, you're definitely missing the boat. It's just a stepstone to really learning a lot more from the greatest teacher out there, the winner. So it's we work really hard to set people up, but what can you do in 4 or 5 days compared to 4 or 5 seasons, 4 or 5 decades? It's just a stepping stone.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Becs, you have anything jump out at you there?
Yeah, I mean, you need to be able to talk the talk, right? So if it does nothing else, it like gets you in the conversation going forward, like with your community, people you're skiing with, the people you're working with. I can, I have, yeah, keeping it short.
Okay. Yeah, I agreed with Don that it's encouraging that 80% said definitely yes, or I think so, which is I think very encouraging. Yeah, Don kind of hit that one there a little bit about thoughts on knowledge classes versus wisdom, that basically the knowledge tees you up for to gain the wisdom over years. So our last little exercise here of the night. So we're going to watch a quick video clip from Robert de Boer. We've referenced him a couple times. He's a Dutch safety engineer who spent a lot of his career working in the aviation world. And we were fortunate that Ethan and the folks at CAIC were able to get him to present at Seesaw back, not this past fall, but the fall before. So we'll listen to some comments that he has, and then
grabbing back to what Ken was saying just a bit earlier about this being a dangerous profession. In preparation for my talk, I did look into the figures, and as you may know, there have been 59 avalanche-related deaths in the US since 1950. And I've taken an easy stab at it with 2,025 members of the AAA. That makes for just under a death per year on average. We can express deaths in micromorts, that's 1 per million events or members or whatever. And so this leads to a danger level of about 1 micromort per day for your kind of work. But because everything's concentrated in the winter months, of course, it's essentially 2.5 micromorts. That is a level of safety that is what aviation had in the 1959. I looked it up just now. And so that's where we've come from, and now we're at a level of between 40 and 200 times safer, depending on which figures you take. 3 micromorts per day, which is a threshold which the WHO has set the World Health Organization, as being just about tolerable risk for any substantial category of workers. And of course, you know that many recreational activities like skydiving, scuba diving, and bungee jumping have a similar fatality or even a higher fatality rate than you, but you're doing this for your job and not for, for fun also, I hope. So that's a big difference with aviation, and we've come a long way since the 1960s. Grabbing back to what.
So to sum up what Robert had to say, the aviation industry's made some huge strides, and we're about where they are fatality rate wise, where they were in 1959, so 60 years ago. So the question, and we'll go to Becs first with this, but considering our industrial budgetary constraints, where we don't have the money that the aviation world does, lift tickets are expensive, but they're not that expensive yet. What can we do to ultimately achieve similar results?
Yeah, like in a nutshell, I thought of three things. So one is like steal from those industries, like look at what they did, try to apply it to our industry, and that is, at least from the aviation, like let's build that data set. It would be super great if we could share information more freely within the industry. I know there's a lot of limitations as far as liability and insurance and legal mumbo jumbo, but getting an idea of where we're really falling flat is a super great place to start. And then on an operational level, like get those communication channels open and talk to one another.
What do you think, Don? Anything jump out at you there?
Well, I think Bex nailed it to a large degree. I think to the people that really resonate with me are Laura McGuire's been doing some awesome work, and she's been at a number of snow and avalanche workshops in the ISSW, and she's looking at decision making on the job, and I think if we can not only learn from our Nearmisses, but there's a really great quote from Robert DeBoer, is understand why things go well. Don't study divorces to understand what makes a successful marriage. So look at what is working well within the industry, and then spread that out so that those procedures, guidelines, recommendations, whatever you call them, or however you implement them, are shared between operations and maybe shared between different sectors within the industry as well. So I think that, we do work in a very dynamic environment, and for the vast majority of the time, successfully and safely. So if we can extend those safe practices even further, that's another step in the right direction. And it takes, I think, some external review to help with that. And that's where Laura McGuire's been super innovative and helpful along those lines. And, something that people don't want to hear is that often to be really successful, it takes discipline and hard work. And yes, powder skiing is awesome, and it needs to be part of the job, because that's what is feeding us. No one's getting rich in this industry, but we do have a lot of fun along the way. That being said, when things are consequential, we need to follow best procedures. So if we can have the discipline to do that, I think that will improve our safety record and our safety culture.
Yeah, interesting. I think, one thing, and Bex kind of got at this, but I think it's something that none of us probably want to hear or admit, but really to eliminate or reduce, because we're probably not going to eliminate it, but to dramatically reduce the amount of workplace injuries and fatalities. The more that I read from other industries about how they've done it, the more that I'm unfortunately convinced that we need to take the decision making out of our own hands because we tend to make really good decisions most of the time. And it's when people who make really good decisions most of the time make one bad decision, that's when they get injured or killed. You know, you can look at behavioral economics for the reasons why, whether it's, empathy gap, that goes on and on and on. It's really hard to train for these. And I think that, I guess, a colleague of mine who you both know, I think Chris Lundy, he's talked about the death of the mountain ninja, where there's this, very mythical, you put the mountain guide or the avalanche forecaster, the ski patroller, the highway worker up on a pedestal, like they have this, full on mythical status as the mountain ninja. And the more that they can be rule based and based on, very flowchart type things, I think that's what's worked for aviation in the medical world. And the list goes on and on and on. I just don't know if we have the collective will as an industry to go down that road or not. So it's going to involve skiing less gnarly runs in heli operations and opening terrain slower in ski operations. It's pretty easy for backcountry forecasters to do something like that, but it's a lot harder for mountain guides who are trying to impress their clients, or, avalanche workers at a ski area who are trying to open up as much good terrain as they can as fast as possible. It's tough. I'm going to throw a question here. We have two from the audience. No one's raising their hand yet, but Matthew Dina wrote, do you feel better methods are possible or needed to make on-the-job training easier, faster, more effective, specific to avalanche workers? Either you want to crack at that one?
Don already answered it.
Pretty
I love
much.
your answer.
Yeah, so I mean, Ava Latisuo and Aleph Johnson Bloom and Lynn Wolf have always been and published studies on mentorship. But the one thing that I think falls away in those studies, which are really effective, is how beneficial it is to the mentors as well. And the mentees get a lot out of it, but if it's done well, I believe that the mentors get as much out of seeing the progress of a mentee or someone they're coaching. It doesn't necessarily have a mentorship role, but maybe just coaching. And it basically they have to think what's been successful for them, what possibly they could have changed to make the learning process faster or quicker or better. All those things in an effective mentorship or coaching relationship really benefits both sides. So that's a maybe not faster way, but probably a more effective way to coach, train avalanche workers. I'm a big fan of institutional knowledge, and the old timers who retire take some of those massive avalanche cycles or bad accidents with them. And then there's no institutional memory of them. So revisiting those, that's something I talked extensively with Duke Barlow about this summer. How do you capture all that? And boy, there's times during high pressure when you're not working 20 hours a day where you can say, hey, let's all get together after work and let's hear this story and, make it comfortable, have the appropriate beverages for whatever people want. And that's a really easy training idea that keeps that institutional knowledge going. And then hopefully convince the person who told this story to put it into the avalanche nearmiss.org. But those are two ideas. There's lots out there. So I'll let you and Becs add to that.
Yeah, what do you think, Becs?
Well, following on from what Don said, we have a staff member who's really into taking this historical data and sharing it within the group. And he's been catching some of those not old timers, but some of those folks that were around for these huge cycles before they move on too far and can't be bothered answering our questions anymore. And it's really fascinating how interesting that is and how much we have used it as an operation since he began doing it 2 or 3 years ago. So I agree with Don, like it's really important.
Yeah, I'll bet. That's awesome that someone decided to make that their mission.
Yeah.
I found the people to listen to are when you propose doing something and you hear kind of muttered in the background, oh, tried that before, it didn't work. You definitely want to push those people to say, oh yeah, why didn't it work last time?
Yeah.
Good point. So we have another question. This is from Gary Kuhn. So do the three of you train for personal or group safety culture? So if so, what and how, maybe even when? And he's talking not like beacon searches, chairlift evac, but so training for safety culture. And I guess I could comment on it. I don't know if it'd necessarily be training, but at the Sawtooth Avalanche Center, so part of our preseason training, we, as a group exercise, go through our safety operations, all facets of it, and do kind of a group edit. So effectively, it's a living document that gets some tweaks every year. And I think as much as we can, it's to eliminate the gray areas from what I've seen, is eliminate those suggestions and recommendation and make them SOPs when you can, just to try to keep things as tight as possible. And that's been a huge benefit for us just operationally to never really put that thing away. It's effectively never finished. So that helps us. I don't know if that really gets at what you're asking, Gary, but Becs or Don, either you have something to add for that?
Right, the benefit of kind of being in a new region over the last 2 years. So we've all been, you know, and I came into a place with folks that had a lot of experience in this area. So it's been really good for, at least over the last year, we've really been reviewing just really common questions in the place, but in our workplace and how we feel about certain procedures or certain SOPs, and kind of just getting the dialogue going. And that's what really got me on this rant for like communication's key. Like we need this open, honest place where we can talk about things and feel good that we're not going to be, you know, frowned upon or whatever for our answers. But as far as formal training goes, not really. Like the more we have these group discussions, then you go off and read something and send someone a paper that you found that covers what you were talking about, things like that, but nothing formal. Don?
I guess I'm struggling to understand the question, but I think it's addressing more communication, teamwork, and support training, in addition to the hard skills that we focus on, such as beacon work and chairlift evac, crevasse rescue. And I know Gary quite well, and we just went through a bunch of training together, both of some of which we both ran. So it's a loaded question, I think, and it's I think there's a lot of room for training it, and I am at a loss for how to train it well. And you know, I think I can come up with areas that we can improve it, but then kind of implementing it into training becomes a little harder than implementing it into day-to-day operations. And so I'm eager to talk to him more about how he thinks we can train it as opposed to implement it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you guys come up with. Sounds really interesting. So we've got 3 live questions. The first one's Terry O'Connor. So Eric, can you unmute Terry and give him the floor?
Cool, thanks, Eric. Hey, Scotty, can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah. Hi, Terry.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have video. I don't have great bandwidth out here at Rotor Run right now, but Thanks for taking this on. A really interesting conversation. I thought I would just add something from, my background. I came from a Park Service aviation background, GAR model, as Don was mentioning before, and then transitioned into medicine around 2000, where there were some serious growing pains happening with medicine, with medical errors. I think it was about 99, the Institute of Medicine came out with a landmark report demonstrating how many fatalities were subsequent to medical errors. And there were some really big growing pains in creating effectively what you guys are talking about here in a safety culture. And I think a lot of it had to do with focus on the individual and the team, and more lack of focus on the organization as a whole. So for instance, back to tracking from the beginning of this conversation, the trainee or those who are just getting into it won't disclose errors out of fear of reprisal. Middle management won't disclose errors out of fear of stalling, their progress and advancement. And of course, the experts, or the ninjas, as to use Chris's terminology, certainly didn't want any threats to their veil of expertise. And what I found, what seemed to work well, and what I actually saw evolve before there was embracing of things like Atul Gawande's checklist manifesto, which certainly has become very commonplace and effective in medicine now, is you really need to cultivate the just culture concept before you cultivate safety culture. And I know many of you on this call may be familiar with just culture, but really that's the concept that you emphasize, that it's the system, it's the organization, not solely the person or persons involved in the incident that are really at fault. And so back to the original kind of hierarchy, someone who's just getting into it needs to demand of their manager or their boss that they need this transparency. They need to feel comfortable sharing mistakes, because I want to become a good doctor, a good nurse, a good, forecaster, a good patroller. The middle management needs to demonstrate that they want to cultivate that, because they want to cultivate, camaraderie as well. And same with the upper management and safety within and the culture to share those. And once there's that kind of transparency, where there's ease of reporting, there's trust, there's independence, there's regular and honest feedback and acknowledgement, then people start to buy in and acknowledge the value of doing a checklist. But up until that happens, I think we are victims of our optimism bias, right? The statistics are there. We know the medical accidents can happen just as much as we know the fatalities can happen in the avalanche industry, but it's never going to be me, right? I'm never going to be the 25%, right? It's like the old poll. If you have a room of 100 people and you have them, raise their hand if they think they're, in the upper 25% of the most humorous, the most attractive, most compassionate, 50 to 75% of people are going to raise their hands, right? So statistically, your perception of yourself and your risk to yourself doesn't match up with the odds. And so we leave people to their own devices. They think it's never going to happen to them. They don't need these tools. But really more thinking about and understanding that fallacy as an individual, understanding that can happen to anybody, then, you utilize that kind of just culture to move it forward. And I will say, then the mechanisms become a lot easier too. And this is the last thing I'll say to not take up too much time, but I've just been tracking some thoughts and listening to you guys here. But, the process in medicine of learning, a lot of it is the morbidity and mortality conference, right? And that's where we actually are. What it feels like when you're training is you're forced to disclose your errors, your near misses, for the benefit of others. And early on, before you understand the value of that learning for yourself, or before the just culture is cultivated, it seems punitive. I'm going to go up there and I'm going to be embarrassed, until you watch your colleagues go up there and see how torn up they are about the near misses and the mistakes they've made. And then all of a sudden it becomes so much more relatable than reading, for instance, Snowy Torrents, or reading an academic paper. And that is a safer free lesson, right? It's a safer near miss. And that's really what, is a very effective tool in kind of understanding the value of protocol and using safety. Because I don't want to be Jill, I don't want to be Joe. That sounded like a really tough case, and I could totally see myself being in that same position. But you can't get to that part without really making sure you have a just culture within your community and organization. So off my soapbox.
Thanks, Terry. And for those of you that don't know Terry, he's got a a pretty broad history in snow and avalanche too, from ski patroller at Alpine Meadows to climbing ranger to then being involved with a little bit of aviation, and then he's been an ER doc for some time. So he's approached this from a lot of different aspects. I think let's get to our next question. Ann Sinclair, Eric, can you get Ann set up there and she can unmute herself? You still out there, Ann?
To unmute, that was a mistake.
There you go. Hi, Ann.
Did you hear what I just said? It was a mistake. I did not intend to unmute.
No, we didn't hear what you said, but now we can hear you.
You know, I have a question, Ann. I think we lost her, Scotty.
I think so. Well, if Ann pops back up, oh, raising her hand was a mistake. Bummer. I thought she'd have a good one.
I know, right?
Well, I guess there's one question here from an anonymous attendee that's a good one. We can wrap it up with this then, unless someone raises their hand. So this will be the end of the night. They say, I'm hearing lots of great references to the need for evidence-based and behavioral science-informed research and policies, but these references seem to allude that this should come from external consultants or other industries. Is it worth considering the makeup of the, in quotes, elite decision makers at the table in our industry and reflect on the general absence of trained behavioral science expertise from those rooms? And, I think some folks kind of are recognizing this, some probably don't know that more and more in recent years, there are a lot of behavioral economists and folks from other walks of life that do this for a living. People like Laura McGuire and Andrea Manberg and George Lowenstein, and there are all kinds of people from all over the place, in addition to the Terry O'Connors. So I think there is more and more of that I don't know if there necessarily is at the table, but they're having a lot of influence on shaping operations, including some key ones. Not necessarily, we're a little 4-person operation in the woods, but I think that's becoming more and more commonplace from what I'm seeing. Maybe I'm seeing it wrong because I'm close to a lot of these folks and working with them. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, Bex, from like your perspective in Colorado, and then yours, Don, from being kind of almost jack of all trades, working for many different operations.
Scotty, I'm sorry, but I was answering a Skype message.
Yeah, no problem. So Don, so basically it's they're suggesting we should have more external consultants, people with broad backgrounds that aren't necessarily Avalanche, who are helping us come up with what we're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's spot on. I'm not sure if we need more trained behavioral science expertise, though if you look at what Ian McCammon did in his foray into understanding human behavior or human factors, it was unbelievably helpful. I've certainly gained the most from just a smattering, from George Lowenstein actually appreciating the empathy gap and how hard it is to have people feel like they're in their shoes, and that or other people's shoes. And that's what Terry was talking about. And I thought that was really eye-opening for me. I feel like when I talk to Seth Carbonari, I learn something every time from the wildland firefighting perspective. And it's good to have people who know your industry and can comment to it. But we kind of do that all the time, and informally and formally. And I find the greater value really comes from people who are experiencing similar problems, but in a different setting. And that's, I don't know if that really answers this question, but it's enormously helpful for me to kind of dive into aviation, wildland firefighting. And I'd hate to admit it, behavioral economics. I never thought I'd say that, but I sure did learn something from George Lowenstein. So that's my perspective. I don't think it addressed the question.
I think it did. And it's, it also kind of reinforces what Beck said to answer the big $1 million question. What can we do to get to where these other industries have already gotten? Is, the trickle down, steal from them and take what's worked for these industries. And whether it's those people doing it or like Don said, people who are familiar with our problems and, borrowing, and then what worked for them, borrowing / stealing, whatever you want to call it, and integrating into it our own operations. I think it already is happening. It's probably a little different where the aviation industry, there's the FAA. With the Avalanche industry, there is no FAA. There are a lot of little disparate umbrellas over it, but right now there is no one who is in the chain of command or control who tells everyone who flies a plane what they're going to do. So we're a little unique from that standpoint.
But but as you guys are saying, like, are we that different? Are we different from wildland firefighter? Like, we obviously a different medium, but similar problems. I just had to say something because I got distracted by Skype.
Perfect. Well, that's all we have, Janie. Back to you.
You guys, thank you so much. That was lovely and informative, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm sorry to cut you off. Here we are. We're at our mark. We're a little bit past. But this webinar was recorded, so it will be sent out in your member email. So if you want to rewatch anything or share it with a colleague, you certainly can. And just thanks to all our sponsors who make this possible. Thanks to Don, Scotty, and Bex, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and spending your evening with us. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Janie. And thanks to Eric for being a wizard in the background.
Yes, and thanks to Eric, who refuses to come on camera, but is our MVP of the night. Have a good one, everyone.